Hey, and welcome back to the Relationship School's Smart Couple podcast. My name is Jayson Gaddis. I'm your host, and I'm here to destroy any fantasies you have about long-term relationship. Okay? I can't tell you how many people get into lots of bullshit fantasies about how relationships work. And that's what they are, folks, fantasies. It rarely works out that way. So this podcast is designed to help you get real and get really honest with yourself, your partner, your future partner, and have a relationship based on growing and developing yourself. Because to me, it's the only way to make it a fulfilling one. I'm grateful for your time and attention here. We've got a really good episode coming up here with the founder of the internal family systems model, Richard Schwartz, otherwise known as Dick Schwartz. Here's a little bit about Dick. Richard Schwartz began his career as a family therapist and academic at the University of Illinois at Chicago. There he discovered that family therapy alone did not achieve full symptom relief. And in asking patients why, he learned that they are plagued by what they called parts. These patients became his teachers as they described how their parts formed networks of interrelationship that resembled the families he'd been working with. So it's like an internal family versus an external one. And he found that as they focused on and thereby separated from their parts, they would shift into a state characterized by qualities like curiosity, calm, confidence, and compassion. He goes over these in the episode. He called that inner essence the self, and was amazed to find that even in severely diagnosed people, traumatized people, etc., there was a self. So from these explorations, the internal family systems model was born in the early 1980s. Okay, it's been around a while. Now it's evidence-based and has become a widely used form of psychotherapy, particularly with trauma. He's actually really good with eating disorders as well, this model. My wife worked with eating disorders for many years and said that a lot of folks were getting really good results with eating disorders with the IFS model. So it provides a non-pathologizing, optimistic, and empowering perspective and a practical and effective set of techniques for working with individuals, couples, families, and more recently, corporations and classrooms. So he lives in Brooklyn, Massachusetts. He's on the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. So this guy is a badass, and it's going to be a fun one. And this is, if you're a therapist, a coach, a practitioner of some kind, you're going to love this. If you're a client who has been to psychotherapy or have done some personal growth work that involved your inner critic or a part of yourself, and fighting with another part of yourself, this is a really good episode. Do you ever find yourself saying that kind of stuff like, well, part of me wants to go and part of me wants to stay? That kind of language is an internal conflict, and Dick Schwartz here is going to help you identify what's going on there and how to work with it inside yourself, or how, if you're a therapist, practitioner, coach, you can also this episode's full of gems for you on how to work with your clients from an IFS model. Now, what's cool here is, as you guys know, I'm a interpersonal neurobiology geek. I'm a nervous system geek right now, and I love the way that we operate together as people and what happens to the animal in us, the scared animal in our nervous systems. It's fascinating to me. And in this interview, Dick doesn't really talk about the nervous system. He doesn't really even almost care, it seems like. Yet his approach gets at the nervous system from a different way, and doing what he calls parts work. And I've done parts work off and on for my whole therapeutic life as a client over the years. Since I was 29 and I first went to therapy, I've entered into a Gestalt training, and Gestalt therapy is where they do a lot of parts work and empty chair work and talking to yourself by moving around in a chair, for example. And I got trained in that, and I got really good at that, both as a client and as a practitioner. And it was extremely valuable for my journey. So it was fun to see this work in action from a different perspective, where you don't necessarily have to move around in chairs, and we can just do it right here if I was on a call with you. So we also just had a really powerful relationship coaches training, and I brought in elements of IFS and Gestalt therapy to the table in training these 8 amazing people how to become relationship coaches. And if that's of interest to you, what's cool about that is you're going to get a whole range of all the trainings I've had synthesized in a consilient way in how I work with people, and I think it's really powerful. I'm a consilient person by nature, meaning I take multiple modalities and I bring them together and I synthesize them, which is why I'm also an integralist. I like taking even seemingly contradictory models and taking the best of both and trying to bring them together, like therapy and coaching, for example, which is how I work with people. So it's really powerful to integrate different models. And just listening to this, I already added a couple of things to my tool belt from Dick, which was really cool. So I love learning new things. This was a really fun interview and very practical, guys. This is not a 30,000-foot interview where it gets really complex into the nervous system. This is a very practical way to work with the different parts of yourself, both from a couple standpoint and an individual standpoint. So if you got a strong inner critic, or if you've got some tension in your relationship, you might consider that there's a part of you that's really scared, another part of you that's young, and another part of you that can hold the whole damn thing. All right. So let's get into it. Here is Mr. Dick Schwartz. Welcome to the show, Dick Schwartz.
Thank you, Jayson. I'm honored to be asked.
Yeah, man. Very glad to have you here and all your wisdom. Psyched to get into what you do, who you are, how you're helping all the people out there with their relationship to themselves and each other. So I usually start by asking people, just by way of introduction, just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're up to in the world.
Okay. My background is as a family therapist, but I, in the early 1980s, got intrigued by this inner phenomena of what we call parts. And as I've sort of devoted my adult life to studying this inner world and finding out about how people's parts relate to each other and how they relate to each other outside. And also, in the process of doing that, discovered what I call the self, which is a undamaged core inside of everybody that knows how to relate both with compassion internally to themselves and also in relationships. And so a lot of what the work is about is helping people access that and then begin healing themselves in inner dialogue work, and then also healing their relationships by staying in self when they talk to each other. So that evolved into what's called now the internal family systems model of psychotherapy. And we're increasingly trying to bring this directly to the public. So I appreciate being asked to talk about it with you. And otherwise, I'm a kind of ordinary guy. I live in the Boston area the last 5 years. Spent most of my time in Chicago area. Grew up there and left, like I say, 5 years ago. And in my second marriage, raised 3 daughters in my first marriage, and do a lot of couples work as well as a lot of individual work. And we have trainings all over the country and all over the world now.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you here. And I know I could talk to someone like you for a really long time about the inner intricacies of human behavior and connection and relationship to ourselves. And today I'd like to focus on 3 specific areas. I've been following you for a while now. My friend Christine Horn introduced me to you. She studied with you years ago. And she, once I figured you out, I was like, oh, this is awesome stuff. Because I come from a Gestalt psychotherapy training. And so I want to get into that a little bit, but I want to focus our conversation on 3 areas. Just a basic introduction to parts work and IFS and why it matters, why people should care about it. Number 2, maybe with a practical example of how do we work with an inner critic, because a lot of us are walking around with that. And then the third part is just around adult attachment. You have some really interesting things to say about adult attachment to a primary versus a secondary versus, ourselves. So I'd love to have those three things be our focal points for our conversation.
Sounds good to me.
All right, cool. So I was trained mostly in Gestalt therapy, which my limited understanding of IFS is a little similar in that sometimes we take parts of ourselves and we talk to them out on a chair, say, or we go back and forth between different parts of us. And my personal healing journey, man, I had to work through a lot of dealing with the different parts of myself. And it wasn't from an IFS model, but it was similar in that the therapist was having me dialogue with this wounded child, essentially, that was hiding behind this massive wall. And that was a pretty intense part of my process. And it was so helpful, though, to tease that out. So how is internal family systems, like what is it? And then how is it different, say, from Gestalt or psychosynthesis or inner child work or voice dialogue?
Yeah. So I was saying, all of those systems you just mentioned recognize what I'm calling parts. Other systems call them other things, but recognize the multiplicity of the mind. And most of those systems also recognize that parts aren't what they seem, which is what I found. I had a little training myself in Gestalt and had done some of the open chair, empty chair work. So I was a little sensitized to the phenomena, but and maybe it's changed since I studied it, but there was mainly the top dog and underdog. There was mainly just a couple parts they were focused on.
Yep.
And then as I was listening to these clients in the early 80s, they would describe a whole inner family of parts that, and because I had this background as a family therapist, I became intrigued not only by what the parts were like themselves, but also about how they related to each other. And was amazed at how similar the way they related to each other was to the way external families related. So one of the differences is that I took this phenomena and applied systems thinking and family therapy to it. And then the other big difference is that I sort of happened on to the discovery, for lack of a better word, that when these parts separate, and by that I mean relax and open space inside of you, the person who's left, the person who kind of pops out at that point, is different from the parts and actually knows how to relate to them in a healing way. And that's true for virtually everybody. We've now used IFS with people that have horrendous backgrounds and very severe diagnoses, and find the same self even in those people. So ultimately, I concluded that core that I'm calling self was in everybody. And so that rather than me working as a therapist, working with the client's parts, or even having parts talk to each other, in IFS, we try to access that place first and then have the client talk to their parts, and not just talk to their parts, but in the example you gave, Jayson, of going to this inner boy that you saw and actually breaking through the wall and maybe even holding him and comforting him and so on. So all of that is a bit different than these other systems you're talking about. What we all had in common, as I say, is an appreciation for multiplicity and how most other systems have pathologized these parts and seen them as the enemy and tried to fight with them.
Yeah, like I got to get rid of this critic and I got to banish him from my life.
Right. And the same is true for most spiritual systems, that the ego is the enemy and a lot of disparaging comments about it, when it's just a collection of parts that's trying to protect you and keep you safe.
Totally. Yeah, and this self you're talking about, you use a capital S. And when you say some of the first part of the work, if I heard you right, is making contact with that part. How do you do that when a lot of people have multiple noisy parts that are kind of running the show? How do you quickly access, if you're a therapist, say, this self that's intact?
So because of my family therapy background, when I would have a client try to work with a part, I would at some point ask them how they felt toward it. And if, say it was the critic you're talking about, and generally people say, I hate it. I want to get rid of it, like you said.
Yeah.
Or they say, I'm really afraid of it. And from my family therapy background, I started to assume that the ones who hated it or the ones that were afraid of it were other parts. So I started saying, because in family therapy, we don't want people to interfere with each other's dialogues. I started saying, could you get the one who's so angry at it to give you a little space and step back inside? And to my astonishment, people would say, okay, it did. And I'd say, now how do you feel toward the critic? It would be something entirely different. And could you get the fear to step back a little bit too? And as I would do that stepping back process, at some point, suddenly, spontaneously, and universally, it's like the same person would come out in each person. It'd be an answer like, how do you feel toward the critic now? I'm just kind of curious about why it calls me names all day. And not only curious, but also at that point, calm and confident and kind of ready to listen, ready to get to know this critic. And when I would ask people about that, what part of you is that? They'd say, that's not a part like these others. That's me, myself. So I came to call that the self.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the kind of hard to believe part of this model is that 30 some years later, I find that that's in everybody.
Yeah. This is a really important distinction you're making between when you start to get in there with a client, let's say, or ourselves, and we think it's ourselves and we're like, oh, I hate it, I want to get rid of it. You're saying that's just another part, and we want to use your step back technique to keep stepping every part back until we can find like almost a neutral stance, right? And that's more of the self.
Yeah, and that neutral stance is a little misleading because it's curiosity, and also shortly after the curiosity will come a kind of compassion for the part. So what we have, what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. So as I studied the self more and more, I found that, again, across people, it was like the same person showed up with all these similar qualities, each of which, oddly enough, began with the letter C. So we have curiosity, calm, compassion, confidence, clarity, courage, creativity, and connectedness.
Mm.
And so it isn't neutral in the sense that you're talking about. It's a place in us that sort of knows that these parts are wounded and knows that the person who you thought was your enemy is actually wounded and is doing it for that reason. And so you have a kind of innate compassion for parts and for people.
Yeah, it's amazing. And from that place, from the 8 C's, from all that clarity and compassion and curiosity and confidence, is the idea here that the self is, because you call it the self-leadership, is that the self is now in charge of a person's life instead of all these parts running it?
Yeah, that's a lot of the goal. We have 3 goals for working with individuals. The first is to release these parts from the extreme roles they've been forced into by what happened to you in your life,
Mm-hmm.
so they can be who they are naturally, and that's always valuable. The second goal, though, is what we call the restoration of trust in the parts in self-leadership. So again, a lot of my analogies come from family therapy, and a lot of these parts are like what we call parentified children.
Yeah.
They aren't equipped to run you,
Yeah.
but they think they have to because something happened when you were young and yourself couldn't protect the system, so they took over. And allowing them to come back and see there is a you in there that really is much better at this helps everybody inside relax. And so that's the second goal. And then the third goal is what we call reharmonizing this inner system. So all the parts that had been polarized and exiled come back together and start to get along, relate internally in a good way.
Yeah, awesome. I just want to review those. So the three goals of IFS say are releasing parts from their extreme behavior, the restoration of trust in self-leadership, and the reharmonizing of the whole system inside. Is that right?
That's right. And that's the three goals for working with an individual. When we're working with couples, you can kind of extrapolate from that, but they're not dissimilar.
Yeah. What would you say when working with couples, since we're jumping there, what's the main difference?
Well, the difference is you have two systems of parts, and usually when couples come initially, both partners are dominated by their protective parts, and it's parts wars, and there's not much self in the room. And so in the beginning, when I work with a couple, I'm really just trying to be in self myself, so that they sense the safety of that. And I'm getting each partner to agree to drop their weapons, basically,
Yeah.
to have their protective parts relax a little bit. And I'm going to ask each of them to allow me to be the parts detector. So when I see one of their protectors jump in, I stop everything and I get both of them to focus inside and find out what parts are jumping up, get those to open space, come back out when you can speak what we call for your parts rather than from your parts.
Yeah, that's huge.
So
yep.
by for your parts, I mean speak from self, from this kind of open-hearted place about what your parts are wanting expressed. And when people can do that, you just have a very different atmosphere in the session. And couples work becomes sort of easy in a way, because mainly I'm just keeping people in that zone, and they start to work out their own issues.
Totally. That's awesome. And I love that distinction between for the self versus from the self. So let's see if can we ground this with an example back to the individual work with, like, let's say a critic. So let's say I've got a part of me that is, I feel like I have low self-worth and I kind of beat up on myself. I'm never doing it right, or I'm not good enough to be in a relationship. Like what's kind of the first step there?
Is that true of you, Jayson? Because we could work with yours if you want.
That was true of mine. That's not true anymore because I'm in an awesome marriage now. Thank God. Yeah.
Okay, so the first step, if you were my client, I would just have you focus on that critical voice and find it in your body, because it helps if we can locate it physically as a kind of anchor point. And then, as I was saying earlier, I would ask you, how do you feel toward this critic as you notice it there? And most people find critics in their head, of course. So as you notice that in your head, how do you feel toward it?
And let's say I'm critical. Let's say I'm critical. That's obviously I'm not. That's not the self. And let's say, well, I want it to go away. I'm tired of it.
Yeah. So then I would say, okay, I can understand why you would want that, because it drives you crazy. But we're going to ask the parts that don't like it and battle with it if they would just give us a chance to get to know it for a minute. And if they'd be willing to give us some space inside and step back and relax, so we can just get to know it a little bit.
Yeah.
And then you might say, well, that's a scary proposition, but you seem to know what you're doing, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so at some point you would say, okay, they step back. And then I'd say, how do you feel toward it now? And by now you might even see an image of it. A lot of people see one of their parents, or they see some kind of monstrous looking thing, or different. And if the part had stepped back, your answer would likely be something like, well, I'm just kind of curious about it. And then I know we have enough self to get the ball rolling, to get started. And so then I would say, okay, then from this place, ask it what it wants you to know about itself, a very non-threatening, open-ended question. And then wait for an answer. Don't think of the answer. Just wait and see what comes from that place in your head. And a lot of times the critic will start with something critical. Yeah. So it might say, I want you to know you're an asshole. And I would, and that might bring back the part that hates it. So I would say, okay, get that part to step back.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's like doing couples therapy inside.
Yeah.
And then, so ask it more about why it calls you names all day. What's it afraid would happen if it didn't do that?
Mm-hmm.
And that question, what's it afraid would happen, will often reveal the protective intention, because all of these parts, no matter how cruel they seem, are really trying to keep us safe.
They have an intelligent function, right?
Yeah. And we're often necessary at a time in our life. And then they get stuck in the role and they don't know you've grown up, and they don't, you don't need their protection the same way.
Yeah.
So in answering what's it afraid would happen, it might say some version of you would make a mistake, or you would fail at something, or you might get hurt by somebody or be criticized by somebody.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different possible answers to that these critics give. Or you might feel good about yourself and take risks. Sometimes that's what they're doing. So once we get that protective intention, and again, it's happening spontaneously. It's not like I'm planting anything in the client to say those things.
Yeah.
Then I can say, okay, how do you feel toward it now? And most people will say, well, I kind of understand it better, and I almost appreciate that it's been trying to keep me safe, but I really don't feel a need for that now, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have them say, okay, let the critic know that, and ask it this: if we could heal the parts that it's trying to protect, so you weren't so vulnerable to being rejected, or you weren't so vulnerable to being hurt by somebody, ask if it would have to do this to you. And I'd say 80% of the time, the immediate answer is no, but I don't think you can do that. And so I would say, okay, we can do that, and ask if it would give us permission to go to the parts it protects so we can heal them and then liberate this one from its critical role. And that getting that permission sometimes takes a bit longer, because there's in most systems, there's a lot of fear about going to these vulnerable places that have been hurt.
Yeah.
But now we've gotten good at negotiating permission, but we don't go to those, what we call exile parts, without permission. Yeah. So, at some point we get permission from the critic, we focus on one of these, like your little boy
mm-hmm.
kind of part. And then we start working with that. And how do you feel toward this boy now? And usually that boy is stuck in a pretty nasty place in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, there's fear of going to him, for fear of being overwhelmed, and we negotiate all that. And at some point when the client is in self again, I have him let the boy know he cares about him and wants to know what happened to him to make him feel so bad. And people will start to become what we call compassionate witnesses to their own histories.
Yeah.
And that's very healing for these parts. That's what they've been wanting, is for you to really get what happened and how bad it was. Not me, the therapist. They want you, the self, to finally get it. And so when that's done, I would even invite you to go into that scene and be with that boy in the way he needed somebody, and then take him out to a safe, comfortable place. At which point, most of these exiled parts are willing to give up the emotions and beliefs they've been carrying, even though they've been carrying these things for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a process for sending them out of your system, at which point that boy transforms, feels much lighter, wants to go play a lot of the time, and no longer is vulnerable, and you become the primary caretaker of that boy.
Yeah, that's so there's all of a sudden this trusting parent-child almost relationship, right? That he hasn't been trusting at all, and now all of a sudden a relationship is forged again.
Exactly. And as it relates to couples, generally a boy like that has been looking outside of you to find the right person who can make him finally feel good about himself. Mm-hmm. And then protective parts of you have been recruiting Mrs. Right, and
i.e.
And
mom.
yeah, often somebody who resembles the person who hurt you originally, because there's this drive to get somebody similar to that person to say, no, you are valuable, and that's there's a big infatuation to
Hmm.
that possibility, because we all want to unload this worthlessness that these young parts carry. But the problem is that person's going to hurt you at some point in a similar way, and so then all your protectors jump back in, and you're off to the races.
And when you,
So
well, let me clarify that. When you say they're going to hurt you in a similar way, you don't mean necessarily intentionally, just through their neurotic way of being in a challenging long-term relationship.
yeah, that and because there isn't anybody in the outside world that can really heal that part of you. So he's going to be disappointed, and yeah, your partner's protectors are going to hurt him somehow, and often inadvertently, and then your protectors are going to come in even more forcefully.
Yeah. Wow, this is really powerful. So again, I'm getting the reminder of your system that's so brilliant is the taking the self-leadership stance where it's the self that's actually doing the reparenting in that moment and witnessing, and the trust restoration happens there.
Exactly. Yeah, this is what we call attachment theory taken inside. So that rather than the therapist or the client's spouse or partner being the good attachment figure to these young, exiled, needy parts, self becomes that. And then the partner can become the secondary attachment figure, but is freed from all the responsibility of being the one who makes you feel good about yourself.
Yeah.
And can't, and then you're not as vulnerable to being hurt by that partner. So, that's I think a big innovation in our approach to couples work, and is quite different from most couples therapies that are based on attachment theory, where they actually do try to get your partner to become the good attachment figure, which from my point of view is a big setup.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there's some that definitely do that. I know some that don't explicitly at least say, "Hey, you're not trying to get your partner to be the primary attachment figure," but there's just sort of a fact that when you partner with someone over many years, they become a very dominant attachment figure in your life that has to be worked with somehow. And what I hear
Yeah,
you saying is rather than kind of put pressure on that person, that limited person to be that, you've got to keep awakening the self leadership to do that. And then the partner becomes, I guess you call it a secondary attachment figure that still can be really powerful and influential in their lives, but not the end all be all.
exactly. That's exactly what we're shooting for. And
Okay.
when people can achieve that, then everything loosens up. A lot of the binds that couples come in with are based on each of them needing the other person to be this certain figure for them. And when that shifts, and we're often doing what I call a U-turn, uh, U like on the road, but also YOU, so that I'm asking couples who come in and are so focused on getting their partner to change, to actually do a U-turn in their focus onto the parts of them that are so desperate for that to happen. And then we do a bunch of healing around that. And now they still may want their partner to change in some ways, but they don't have that same level of desperation and pressure.
Yeah. Hey, what's up? Quick interruption from the relationship school here. Remember, it's the last chance pretty much to get into the Embracing Conflict weekend here in Boulder, Colorado. We will not be doing this training again until probably November or 2019. So now is your chance. February 9th through the 11th here in Boulder, Colorado. And I just want to give a shout out to Tanya, who was at our Embracing Conflict weekend in the fall and had a really beautiful breakthrough. Tanya sent me an email shortly after the weekend and said, I'm going to try to give you a shortened version of what just happened to me because everything I learned this weekend literally just hit me and I broke down in tears on the bathroom floor in my hotel room, completely flooded with every emotion from the child, Tanya, that I've locked up for 37 years. And then this email is so powerful. She went on to just get it, basically, that she has been blaming other people. And now she sees that it was partly this hurt little kid inside of her. And her fear, and she's stepping into a brand new Tanya. So Tanya, thank you for sharing your heart and words with us and doing the work. And if you want to be like Tanya and have an experience like Tanya, come join us. relationshipschool.net/embracing conflict. Okay. We're running out of time here, guys, for you to come join us here in Boulder, Colorado. Let's do this and finally say yes to conflict. No more running away. All right. Let's go. All right. Back to Mr. Dick Schwartz. Okay. Let's take this into my marriage here just to get, again, more practical with the couples work and the nervous system. So I'm curious to get your take on the nervous system and co-regulation as a term. You're familiar with that term?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the idea here is that my wife and I are, let's say she gives me a certain look or looks away from me, and it just fires my nervous system because of an old historical memory or just because that's how my body works. And I perceive a threat of some kind, right? And in co-regulation, the work is, well, she's, okay, I just got upset. Now we're dysregulated as a couple. And in co-regulation, it's like my wife has somewhat of a responsibility to take good care of me in a kind of a friend kind of way. Like, hey, I get that whatever I just did has an impact on you. Let's see if we can repair that and try to get each other's nervous systems to be sort of a safe homing device for the other one. And how would you, from an IFS model, how would that be different or similar here?
Yeah, so first of all, it'd be a different language. So when she gave you the dirty look, I wouldn't talk at all about your nervous system. I would just say, yeah, there was a vulnerable part of you that got hurt by that, and then a protector came to protect you. And let's find out about those two parts and what's going on. And they definitely will affect your nervous system, but there's something more empowering, I find, to not think of it as I'm born with this kind of nervous system, and instead think of it, well, there are these parts that I can actually work with on a daily basis that do all these triggers, and I can get them out of where they're stuck in the past so the same look from my wife doesn't trigger the same kind of nervous system response. So anyway, that would be one difference. And then, yes, ideally, then you would come to your partner and say, from self, speaking for that hurt part, honey, when you looked at me that way, it triggered this young part of me that felt a lot of shame about that. And I just want you to know that. But to say it from this place of self with an open heart, and also to have her know it's just a little part of you that's angry. And speak for the angry part too. But just knowing it's just little parts of you, there's something in that message too that's disarming to your partner. And then easier to hear. And so ideally, she would get her protectors to step back and hear it from self and be able to respond in a reparative way with, okay, I get that happened. And, this was what was going on with me that I gave you that look. And I apologize that I let that part take over at that time because I can see that it hurt you. But I just want you to know this is what was going on for me, something like that.
Okay. So this is what you're calling attachment theory from the inside, where it's the partners, where my wife and I are a secondary attachment figure for each other.
Yeah.
But the first move, it sounds like if I hear you right, the first move is to go to self and go to like my own internal system here and try to get myself and the parts to step back and myself to come forward. And so then eventually, an hour later, a day later, however long, as soon as possible, come speak to my wife from self.
Exactly. So the first move is, okay, you do the U-turn. You go inside and you listen to what happened inside when she gave you the look. And then you identify the parts that are involved, and then you listen to them enough that you can speak for them to her. And then as you approach her, you work with everybody to allow you to stay and not have them take over when you talk.
Yeah.
And then you represent them well. And then she doesn't react. Her protectors don't get triggered, and she can do the same. So it's It's a kind of positive spiral then.
Yeah, that it creates, totally. Um, Dick, when you do this work with couples and maybe in your own life and with people, do you find that, because some of these fears, it seems to me, just in my own experience, having done a lot of therapy and personal growth work, that there's certain fears that the nervous system that not necessarily can be resolved. Like it seems intelligent as a human mammal that I'm always going to be afraid to be left by the crowd or and not belong, right? To be cast out. That's a intelligent system that fires in my body, and it doesn't have to necessarily do with another person's behavior. It's just, I'm an animal and I don't want to be left out. What do you say to that?
Yeah, we do have innate fears, fear of dying, for example, or a bunch of different fears, but those get supercharged by the parts that get hurt in the past in times where we almost did die, for example, or where we were outcast in elementary school or something like that. So that natural fear gets becomes a big constant fear. And when you ever get triggered, when that part of you that now carries what we call the burden of the terror from previous experience, whenever that gets triggered, you don't just have the natural fear, you have the supercharged version of it. So that's what we can unload in this healing process, so that a potential rejection will generate a certain amount of fear in you, but it's not going to be overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I love it. Yeah, it's like added on fears from these parts that get easily triggered and are bringing in their baggage from the past, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And for a couple out there that's wants to like practice this at home, are there some prerequisites to be able to do this level of, without a therapist, say, to do this level of self leadership?
There are things people can read. I have an introduction to IFS book, and then there's a book called "You're the One You've Been Waiting For,"
Yeah.
which apropos of what we've been talking about, which couples seem to like a lot. And so there's a certain amount that people can do on their own. It's a challenge when you try to heal exiles yourself. So for that, we recommend people go to an actual IFS therapist. And luckily, there are IFS therapists all over the world now.
Yeah. Okay. And let me come back to the couple example for a minute. And we'll go over those resources again at the end for the listener. When the spiritual movement seems to promote a self-leadership protocol in terms of, and it's something I definitely practice, maybe not in this way because this sounds a lot more intelligent, but how I used to do it in my wife and I's early part of our marriage was I would get triggered, she'd get triggered, and it's like, okay, let's go to our separate corners of the house and deal, because my nervous system and my inner child and my woundedness is my responsibility, and she's not my mom, and she's not supposed to take care of me here. And that was actually beneficial for someone with my history and her history. It was a good step. And it feels, at a certain point, our conclusion was that felt slower than, and I'm not saying you're saying that, by the way, but it felt slower and less efficient than what I'm calling this co-regulation, where when we get upset, we stay in the room and we try to help each other out by working, yes, with ourselves and our own breath and just our own body, but also being a kind presence toward the other person without any of the self-leadership tools you're talking about, other than just, I know how to be with my own upset, so I can do that now. What would you say about that in terms of kind of the spiritual movement promoting this overly independent way to deal with our own issues in a relationship versus being a team and trying to deal with this together?
I would say for the first, too many systems. I mean, there's some truth in you have to take care of yourself, but too many systems say that, but they don't tell you how to do it. So that they say, go to your corner and, be responsible for yourself. But they don't help you actually go to the parts that are hurting and need your comfort. They actually see that as the ego, like I was saying earlier, and often try to get you to just meditate it away.
Yeah.
Which doesn't really work.
Yeah, I tried that.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with meditation. It works for a lot of things, but it doesn't heal a lot of this very vulnerable stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
So, and then, when you can do it, it's great if you can stay and try to, as you're calling it, co-regulate each other. And so when my wife and I are in a good place and we get triggered, we do stay, and we can talk it out in a, speaking for our parts, and both of us trying our best to stay in self. And it really works. It really helps. There are some times where we're so triggered that we do have to separate for, like you said, an hour or more sometimes. And we've also now worked with the parts that panic when we're in the fight and we go into our separate corners. So we can allow that, and we trust that we're both going to come back when we can both be self-led and talk it through. But again, when we go out, we're not just saying, I'm responsible for myself. I'm saying, I'm focusing inside and saying, now who got hurt, and tell me about it, and what do you want me to tell Gene about that? And, did this take you somewhere in the past? And stuff like that.
Yeah. You're saying don't do that?
I'm saying do that.
Okay, do that. Like basically educate each other about what part just came up, what happened, and how it maybe is connected to your past, so that you can have a conversation about it and learn more about each other there.
Yeah, and I'm often telling couples, don't just listen to the protective parts, because speaking for them will get you so far. But if you can learn about what they protect and speak for the vulnerable parts to your partner from self, that your partner's heart's going to melt.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work is helping create enough safety where partners can disclose about their vulnerabilities to each other from this open-hearted place, which not only resolves the conflict, but also makes them feel more intimate and connected to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's powerful. I love this. It's sounding to me like a both and here for me as I listen to you, that what you're providing and what you're offering and what I know and have read about IFS is the how. How do we self-regulate? How do we take good care of ourselves when we get upset in a relationship? And you're giving us a map to do that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful, because again, like you said, I don't think there's a lot of maps out there that are giving people a map on how to deal with themselves when they're triggered. It's more like, okay, go be with your upset and just go sit and breathe into it. And that actually does work to a point. It's helpful, but this is much more nuanced and probably accurate in terms of what's really going on inside.
Thank you. And ideally, you wind up not only listening and speaking for, but you kind of bookmark what we call the trailhead. Your wife triggered you, and now you know that's something you got to work with. So then either you go to a therapist and do the healing work that makes that no longer such a trigger, or you maybe do that on your own. So it's allowing your partner to be what I call your tormentor, with a hyphen between the tor and the mentor.
Yeah, I've heard you say that before.
By triggering you, your partner is teaching you what you need to heal.
Man, I'm so aligned with that. In that way, I call it relationship is a path to healing, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very behind that. Yeah.
Yeah. Feels so true. Mentor. I'm gonna bookmark that one. That one's good.
Uh-huh. Right.
Nice. Well, Dick, I'm really appreciating it. I've got a few more questions for you here. Um, just, you kind of guided us through a pretty awesome example there in the beginning about an inner critic. If someone is dealing with an inner critic, a harsh inner voice, just one tip for them to start out, just one piece of advice for them.
To not assume it is what they think it is. It's not just an internalization of your mother's voice or something like that. It's a part of you trying to protect you somehow. And if you can think of it that way, it just isn't going to have the same level of power over you.
Yeah. That brings up another slew of questions, but I'll try to just take a couple of short ones. You said, that was interesting. You said it's not just an introject or some voice we've swallowed from our parents from the past that we just now took on. It's also, could be that, but it's also, you're saying, just a protective part.
Yeah, what I'm saying is often these parts will take on your mother's voice because you listen to your mother and they don't know any other way to motivate you. So it does take that in. And that's what's called an introject, but it carries your mother's energy, but that's not who the part is. The part is a very valuable inner being who's trying to keep you safe by using your mother's voice.
Yeah, I think for hearing all of that and knowing your work a little bit, I would say you got to reframe everything as all of these parts are actually trying their best to help you. And it's not coming out so well and it's not feeling so good, but there is a positive intent or some intrinsic intelligence to the action or the behavior. But we got to get below that, right?
Yeah, it helps to remember that they're also, most all of them, stuck in the past in a time in your life when they were really necessary. And then it's sort of like those Japanese soldiers after World War II is over and don't know it, and they're still fighting the war in the jungle on an island.
Right.
They just keep going like they still need to do this job, even though you've grown up and you don't need that kind of protection anymore.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing, Jayson, is not only are they positively intended, but they're very happy to leave these roles once they think it's safe to do that and be who they're designed to be. And it's always very valuable, and it's often the opposite of what they've been doing. Like often when inner critic is freed up, now it wants to be your cheerleader, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's even stronger, right? And instead of feeling stress from this tension inside my body and my mind from this relationship I have with myself, I'm now feeling like support and like I've got someone at my back.
Exactly.
Yeah, super cool. Dick, what advice do you have for the therapists listening? Maybe just one piece of advice for them in working with their clients.
There's a book by one of my trainers whose name is Tony Herbine Blank on IFS with couples. I forget the exact name, but rather than giving one piece of advice, a lot of what I just talked about is in that book.
Okay, great. It's kind of a setup question. Hey, can you help therapists? I know it's a big job. All right, fair enough. And excuse me, I want to get some advice from you. I started this relationship school, and I'm on a mission to reach 1 million young people with basic relationship education because none of us are taught how to work out our differences in school, for example. And so I'm on a mission to do that, and I love asking my guests like you and people, especially with your level of experience, what if you could whisper in my ear and I had a room full of 1,000 young people and maybe their parents, advice, just one piece of advice on relationships, what would you tell me to tell them?
On relationships, yeah. I think primarily what I said earlier about try to work with yourself so that you don't go looking for this savior out there to take care of your parts, that there's a way you can actually take care of yourself so that you feel good about yourself and then get into a relationship.
Yeah. Yep. It's interesting. A lot of people have suggested some version of that in different ways. And I like how you said it there. And I hear, again, that if a young person can have this kind of relationship with themselves, that it's likely that they're going to have, a more successful or fulfilling relationship with someone else.
Yeah, I can play off of that for a second. So
Okay.
the way you relate to these parts of you will be mirrored in the way you relate to your partner. So if your partner suddenly becomes that internal critic outside and says something that is similar to your internal critic, then you're going to relate to her in the way you relate to that part of you. Does
Yep.
that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
similarly, if you're very afraid of that little boy inside of you who's so weak and vulnerable, then when your partner becomes weak and vulnerable, it's gonna make you anxious, and
Yep.
you're gonna find a way to get her out of that.
Yeah.
And that's not good either. So it's all very parallel.
Yeah, so for the listener, rewind this last like 2 minutes there and make sure you put that in bold if you'd write that down, because that feels so, so important, that what is going on inside, you're going to project onto and attract probably a partner who behaves similar, and whatever you're not okay with in yourself is something you're going to try to push away or get away from. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly what I'm saying. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, beautifully said there. Thanks for that reminder. Cool, Dick. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you and what you're up to and all the work you've done. Where can people find you, find your books? Obviously on Amazon, of course, but what's your website? And tell people maybe what's next or what's alive for you in 2018.
Yeah, so our website is selfleadership.org. And we have a store where you can find all these books I've been talking about on the website. And I'm at a point where I feel good about where we are as a school of psychotherapy. And as I said at the beginning, we're trying to now bring this more to the public so people can do this on their own. So I'm working on a book to do that, and a variety of other projects designed to bring it to the culture in a bigger way. And so talking to you, Jayson, has been helpful in that way too.
Great. Yeah, that was my next question, is how else can I help you get this to the public? Because that feels essential, because I know your books are somewhat technical, and I that was exciting to hear that you're writing a book more for mainstream.
Yeah. Let's talk. I'd be happy to collaborate or talk more. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Cool. Yeah, me too. Thanks. I think your system here is effective, and it feels inspiring to me, and it's really accessible. It's not actually some weird, maybe some people would judge it as weird, but not to me. But it's not way out there. It's like really straightforward, because most people, if they're listening, are like, yeah, I have different parts of me, and I want
Right.
they're kind of at war, and I want to have that be different.
Yeah, I'll mention one other book. I just came out with a book called Many Minds, One Self, that is an attempt to substantiate what you just said, that this idea that people are multiple, naturally multiple, has been around both in our culture and also in psychotherapy for hundreds of years. And, it comes bubbling up as I have, and then it gets shut back down over and over. So I documented all of that. And then I also tried to look at the concept of self and how it shows up in different spiritual traditions. So, and what you find is basically especially the more esoteric branches of every spiritual tradition, the meditators, the contemplatives, talk about the same thing, whether it's Atman or Buddha nature or the Tao, or they're really talking about what I'm calling self.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating to research all that, and it's an attempt to substantiate this beyond my little pea brain. So
That's good. That's really cool. I'm glad you're doing that or did that. And let me ask you a clarifying question there. You said it bubbles up and then it gets shut down. What do you mean it gets shut down, and why is that?
you know, as I went through the book, a number of the reasons. So, for example, William James was really into this.
Mm-hmm.
And then World War I came, and there was these protective parts of the culture took over and became very rational and behavioristic. And so these conceptions of the mind kind of wax and wane. And then you might think this would be odd, but Freud, who had a multiplicity model in the sense of id, ego, and superego, talked about the id as this cauldron of primitive drives that there's no point in trying to talk to or listen to. So that discouraged people from actually focusing inside too. So that's what I mean. It just kind of comes forward that people are naturally multiple. And then in more modern times, it was pathologized in the MPD, the multiple personality world.
Yep.
And so people got very frightened of parts and saw them as signs that you're really crazy.
You're crazy, yeah. Dissociative identity disorder and so on, yeah.
Yeah. So all of these are different ways that it all gets suppressed.
Interesting. Do people criticize you that way? Is that still going on?
Not much anymore. It was a big criticism early on. I developed this in Chicago, and there were a lot. Heinz Kohut was there, and so there was a lot of his fear of fragmenting in the atmosphere. So whenever I would present, they would say, "Oh no, you don't want to go there because you're going to fragment people."
Interesting.
So, yeah. So it's been a long journey.
Wow, man. Well, dude, thanks for your courage, your bravery, for blazing that trail, and for bringing it out to all of us.
Well, I'm honored to talk about it with Jayson. Thank you.
Yeah, was that not so good? I thought it was great, and simple, practical stuff here. And just try it on, that you've got these different parts cruising around inside your own being, and that by having a conversation with yourself, you're not crazy. You're trying to actually integrate. Okay, so when you find yourself talking to yourself, or you think it's weird that you have contradictory parts of yourself inside, I hope this interview helped you normalize that you're a normal human being, and you've got some different wounds in there that are causing you to argue with yourself. And so here's your action step, okay? And it's really just about finding the self that Dick talked about, the person that ultimately you want driving the bus in your life. So when you get fused to your reactivity, you lose that sense of self, and you feel like you make big global statements like, I don't trust myself, I hate myself, there's something wrong with me, no one likes me, I'm not lovable. And you forget that there's a self that can hold that hurt part of yourself, that old or young part of yourself, all right? So find the self. And if you want to take it to the next level, then you go train with Dick, and I suggest you check out his stuff. It's really cool. Or find an IFS therapist in your town. Or if you like how we roll here, then you come train with us, and we incorporate elements of IFS and Gestalt in our coaching, because our relationship coaching, my wife and I were talking about it last night, actually, and I was like, I had no idea I was taking on such depth when I was going to train people how to do what I do. This is not a simple 8-week learn how to be a coach course, or a 6-month how to be a coach and how to help people solve their problems and fix them, and hey guys, set some goals. And the coach's training I'm doing is ridiculously deep, because it's who I am, and it's coming from me and all my experience with all these different models. So if you like what we're doing here at the Relationship School, and you like this interview, for example, you're going to enjoy the training that we do here. And you go to the website relationshipschool.net/apprentice if you want to find out more. We're taking applications now for next fall. We're already sold out this year, starting in January. So you can't get on the bus now. It's too late, but you certainly can apply and move in that direction and set your intention now for September. All right. And it's going to fill up quick. I can guarantee that. As a baby step, if you don't want to do that, you can certainly join our Relationship School Roots community. That's relationshipschool.net/roots. If you want to start getting involved here, guys, and getting in touch with other growth development people, you come deal and you get honest, because your friends are holding you back most likely in your relationships. So start to explore and hang around people on the relationship growth path, all right, that want deep, fulfilling relationships. And they can be singles, partnered individuals, couples, it doesn't matter. Be around people like that. And Roots is one place to go. Okay, and then finally, it's almost your last chance here. There might be one more announcement on the podcast about the Embracing Conflict Weekend. It's February 9th, 10th, and 11th. And you can bring a friend for half price, so get it now, and we'll see you there. It's going to be a really good time here in Boulder, Colorado. Okay, folks, thanks again. Talk soon.